We'll be reading both of these from the New Revised Standard Version, beginning with Genesis. The same night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him in the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to Jacob, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. And from Luke. Then Jesus told the disciples a parable about their need to pray always and not lose heart. Jesus said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, 'Grant me justice against my opponent.' For a while he refused. But later he said to himself, 'Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" This is the word of the Lord, and thanks be to God. The Lectionary Committee, in following the Gospel of Luke throughout this particular year cycle, has come to this story about the widow pestering a judge. And in their desire to find a complementary Old Testament lesson, they selected the story of Jacob wrestling all night by the river. So we have 2 stories of perseverance: Jacob wrestling all night, and the widow's continual appearance outside of a judge's home. The point of each story is to encourage listeners to go and do likewise. Persevere. Don't give up. To begin, let's look at the Genesis passage. These particular verses from chapter 32 are part of what biblical scholars call the Jacob cycle. Jacob, as you remember, is the younger of Isaac's twin sons. He is named Jacob, the one who grasps, because when he and Esau were born, Jacob emerged holding on to his older brother's heel. As he grew up, the name fit his character, in that Jacob reached out and took his brother's birthright. And later, he took the blessing of his father intended to give his brother. Jacob supplanted Esau in every way that mattered. And as a result, he had to flee to his uncle's home so Esau would not follow through on his threat to kill him. he was at his uncle Laban's home, he met and fell in love with his cousin Rachel and wished to marry her. Laban, a sly fella in his own right, which seems to prove that this trickster sort of capacity runs in the family, double-crossed Jacob and put Rachel's older sister Leah in her place after a 7-year hitch of service to his uncle had ended. Jacob was not pleased and was forced to commit to another 7 years of service in order to marry Rachel. Jacob prospered and had many children with his 2 wives and their handmaids, and he also amassed a great deal of livestock and other material wealth. As a matter of fact, he had made so much that Laban decided that part of the world was too small for the both of them, and he made the suggestion that Jacob return to his father's land. I'm pretty sure Laban knew about the difficult relationship Jacob had with Esau, and I'm also pretty sure that Laban did not care. All he wanted was Jacob out of there, because Jacob was absorbing all the resources that Laban considered his. So as they departed one from the other, they prayed that God would keep an eye on each of them. As Jacob neared his homeland, word comes to him that his brother Esau and a whole lot of men, 400, were on their way to meet him. Verse 7 says, "Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed." Yep, you bet. He divides his entire company into 2, thinking that, well, if Esau comes on the attack, maybe half of my possessions will survive. He further sends them on ahead of him to meet his brother. Earlier in chapter 32, it says that he sends 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels and their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He intends for these to be gifts to appease his angry brother. He then sends his 2 wives, 11 children, and the rest of his people across the river. His reasoning is that Esau will be taken off guard by the amount of Jacob's possessions and the fact that he is essentially offering them up to him. There doesn't seem to be any reason whatsoever that Esau would simply gather this all up and leave Jacob alone with nothing, the way he was when he fled. So, this gets us to the wrestling match. Now, traditional interpretations identify the person with whom Jacob wrestled as a messenger from God or an angel. I think that maybe when this being first showed up, Jacob probably thought that he was one of his brother Esau's men, sneaking up to assassinate him, because by this time Esau probably knew he's by himself over there. This is my chance. So this wrestling match has a life or death quality to it. Yet, as the night wears on and the sun rises and his opponent tells him to let him go, he has to leave, Jacob figures out, this isn't one of Esau's men. It's God's man. And even after this person attempts to break free by wounding Jacob, Jacob still won't let him go. "Bless me," he says. It's odd that Jacob would want a blessing. I mean, at this point, he was a very wealthy man, and he understood that he was in line for God's promise to Abraham to be a great nation. So why a blessing from this person? The man adds more confusion because he asks him his name and then renames him. And then Jacob lets him go, discovering that this man was from God. Who else but God would have understood so fundamentally the mind and heart of Jacob as to call him Israel. Who else but God would fathom the complex character of Jacob's being and boldly designate him someone who scraps with God? And who else but God would be so daring as to bestow a blessing on this person? A blessing that implies a special and continuing relationship between the deity and the individual. Jacob persisted and was renamed. But in being renamed, he was shown that God recognized him deeply and fully. I've read some commentary that says Jacob was wrestling with his own conscience that night. His psyche took on human form and forced him to grapple with all his behavior from the past. I think there's some merit in that. Sometimes our decisions have unforeseen consequences, and at some point, those consequences come calling on us. Last night, David and I had an opportunity to join a rabbi friend of ours for a celebration of Sukkot, which is the Jewish festival that is happening right now. It's the Festival of Booths. It's the time when observant Jews build a temporary structure somewhere in their property, and they spend some time in it. Our friend David, who is the rabbi, takes his morning coffee out there, and sometimes, if it's not too drippy, they will have a family meal out there. The idea is to build this booth to remind Jews of their time in the wilderness, the time when they did not have a home. Their home was not permanent. And so it gives them an opportunity to consider the blessings that God has given them and be thankful and be grateful. I think it's a pretty cool discipline. But anyway, we were at Rabbi David's house last night, and I asked him about this particular passage. Do you have any insight about Jacob wrestling with the angel? And he pretty much reiterated that idea that Jacob was wrestling with himself. Because Jacob knew who he was. He knew his own scheming character. The way he did a hard sell, a hard bargain with his brother Esau to get the birthright, and then did sort of a soft kind of roundabout way of getting the blessing, including his mother Rebekah in the subterfuge. He also knows what he did to get some of the stock from his uncle. So he knows that there are things about himself that are not considered upright. And so, when he is left alone by the river, an ancient people would have understood a river to be a place that was a boundary. It is a boundary. A river marks boundaries. The Shenandoah, the Potomac, they mark boundaries. But people of ancient times would have understood that boundaries have with them supernatural guardians. And so when the people heard this story about Jacob being alone by the side of a river and suddenly wrestling with someone, they would have said, oh, supernatural being. So that's where we get this idea that it was an angel. I really do like the idea, though, that it was Jacob wrestling with himself. Because he was going home. He was going back to the land that God had promised his ancestor Abraham. And if he was going to assume the mantle of that responsibility of being part of the patriarchy, he needed to change. He needed to be somebody different than who he had been. Jacob could not have helped but understand his own conniving ways, the less than amicable leave-taking from Laban and his fear of encountering Esau, owed in part to his own schemes and tricks. And so what he learns in the struggle at the riverside is that while he was a schemer, he was now turning a corner and straightening out his path. Also, God knows who he is and continues to accept him. I'm sure this story of Jacob seeing opportunities and taking them, persevering until sunrise and receiving a blessing of identity, of being seen, is what motivates the widow outside the judge's gate. Jacob's story is her story. She is one of those countless descendants who is claiming her place in the family by continuing her pursuit until she has the attention of the one who will grant her an audience. Jacob's opponent was his past behavior. Her opponent is a present neighbor and a judge. She had no clout in the community. She did not know the mayor of the town or any of the county commissioners who might pull strings for her to get her a case on the docket. All she could do was go back time and again and hound the judge. She turned up regularly at the gates where he held court, and she pursued him on the street and in the shops. She would not let him rest until he granted her justice. And finally, exasperated, the judge gives in. Otherwise, this widow will keep after me until she gives me a black eye. The widow became a model for early Christians to teach them to pray and not lose heart. She was a reminder in days of crisis and moments of despair to continue to pray. Prayer was not a last resort when all the plans and programs and power plays had failed. Prayer was rather first and a primary task. Her prayerful pursuit of justice became an expression of deep faith, the kind of faith the Son of Man seeks. The early Christians thought about the judge. Look, they reasoned, if an unscrupulous person like this heartless judge gave in to unceasing pleas of the widow, how much more will God listen to his people as they cry day and night for justice in the world? How God can be counted on to vindicate the oppressed. God won't turn a deaf ear to our prayers. So, we persist. Debbie Thomas, who writes at the blog Journey with Jesus, writes about this parable. What happens when we pray? She says. What is prayer for? I can only speak from experience, but I know that when I persist in prayer, really persist with a full heart over a long period of time, something happens to me. My sense of who I am, to whom I belong, what really matters in this life, and why, these things mature and solidify. My heart grows stronger. It becomes less fragile and flighty. Once in a while, it even soars. And sometimes, here's the surprise, she says, these good things happen even when I don't receive the answer I'm praying for. Now, unanswered prayer does take a toll. It hurts and it baffles us. It can break our hearts. But maybe that's the point of this parable too. The work of prayer is hard. It's like wrestling all night by the side of a river. The widow's predicament is not straightforward. She has to make a costly choice every single day. Will I ask today? Dare I risk humiliation one more time? Do I still believe that my request is worthy of an answer? Can I be patient? Am I still capable of trusting the possibility of justice being done? In this week's readings, in the Genesis story and in the parable in Luke, faith, trust, is about persistence. The widow persists in her belief that good things will come to her, even when the odds look terrible. And Jacob, wrestling in total darkness, persists until the blessing of a new name and a new future are granted to him. The widow persists because she knows she's right. Jacob persists because he knows he's been wrong. Each believes that life will be different on the other side of the struggle. So looking at these two, let us also trust that God sees us and knows our own struggles to persist. And in the end, what will our persistence bring about? God bless you in your persistent struggle. Amen.